He stood in the god's wood of Winterfell, beneath the ancient weirwood whose face was carved and stained with centuries of red sap tears, and thought about the heavy choice before him. The crisp air carried the scent of pine and promised snowfall, but Eddard Stark barely felt the cold that should have made him shiver. Instead, he was lost in the storm of his own thoughts. For years, he had been taught that duty, honor, and family were the pillars upon which House Stark was built. It was on those pillars that he had so often leaned when the world turned dark. Now the world had turned darker than he ever imagined. His father and brother had been taken by the Mad King's cruelty. His sister was hidden away, rumored to be with Rhaegar Targaryen, the very prince whose family was the cause of so much suffering. And yet, there were new truths stirring that he could not ignore, truths that bent his honor in ways he had never thought possible. Ned recalled the letter that had come not 2 days past, borne on the wings of a raven from King's Landing. It was sealed with the three-headed dragon of House Targaryen rather than the flayed man of House Bolton or the kraken of House Greyjoy or any other great house of the realm, which had been more common in correspondence since the rebellion began. This letter was different, and it had stunned him with its quiet entreaty. It spoke not of madness but of justice, not of cruelty but of regret. Though it named itself as coming from the Mad King, Aerys too, Ned suspected that it was the voice of Rhaegar behind the words. It asked for parley. It admitted to grave errors and invited the North to consider a path forward that would prevent further bloodshed. Ned had read it over and over, his brow furrowed, his heart uncertain. He thought of Robert Baratheon, his friend, his comrade in arms, who burned with righteous fury to topple the Targaryens. He thought of Jon Arryn, the man who had fostered both him and Robert, the man to whom Ned owed unbreakable loyalty, or so he had believed. And yet here Ned stood, in the presence of an old, silent god, weighing the unthinkable, to betray Robert Baratheon and side with the Targaryens in the name of preserving what remained of his family. He remembered the day his father and brother had died at the hands of Aerys. The heartbreak and outrage that had compelled the North to muster its banners in support of the rebellion were still fresh wounds in his memory. But with the quiet revelations that had emerged since Lyanna's disappearance, pieces of a puzzle began aligning into a different picture. Rhaegar was not the monster Robert painted him to be. There were rumors that Lyanna had not been taken by force at all, that some manner of love had bloomed between her and the silver-haired prince. It sounded impossible at first, a Stark princess and a Targaryen prince forging a bond in secret. But rumor after rumor found its way to Ned, from lords and knights alike, each whispering that Rhaegar was not his father's son in spirit. Many said that Rhaegar was a man of music, prophecy, and thoughtful command, not the wanton cruelty that the Mad King embodied. Ned had been prepared to dismiss these whispers until the letter arrived, revealing some final piece that might salvage the realm from the fires of war. He did not want to doubt Robert, for Robert was like a brother to him. And yet, Ned could not deny that Robert's thirst for vengeance had grown to overshadow every other aspect of the war. Where once Robert had fought to unseat a tyrant, now he seemed to fight for the eradication of a family line, to put an end to House Targaryen entirely. Could Ned stand by such zeal if there was a chance for compromise, a chance for the realm to avoid further butchery? It was not simple. Robert believed in his cause, and so did many others. They saw the Targaryens as a blight upon the Seven Kingdoms. But Ned had met men from the Crownlands who recalled Rhaegar's generosity. He had seen how the small folk, time and again, claimed that the prince had once been their hope for a better future before the rebellion shattered everything. Even Ser Barristan Selmy, the famed Kingsguard, was rumored to speak highly of Rhaegar whenever the chance arose. Winterfell's Godswood was quiet, the red leaves barely rustling in the mild breeze. The branches overhead wove a tapestry of half-dead leaves and new buds, as though the old tree itself stood at a crossroads of seasons. Ned placed a hand on the trunk, feeling the rough bark beneath his gloved palm. Did his father's spirit live here now, watching him from those carved eyes? Did Brandon's ghost stand at his side, urging him to remember justice? Perhaps they watched, or perhaps they were gone to the beyond. But Ned's breath tightened with the sense of being judged, not only by the gods but by the memory of every Stark who had come before him. Betraying one's friend was a sin in the North, a violation of the guest right of the soul. Yet to stand behind Robert blindly might lead to horrors he could not wash from his hands. If the Targaryens truly were ready to parley, then the war could end. The realm might know peace sooner than expected. And maybe, just maybe, his sister could live out her days in some measure of happiness if Rhaegar was truly the man those rumors claimed him to be. That night, Ned called Maester Luwin to his solar. He asked the Maester to read the letter again, to analyze every line and every flourish of penmanship. Luwin, who was skilled at reading subtlety from ink and words, confirmed that the style was not Aerys's. The Mad King's ravings usually spilled onto parchment in stilted phrases or were dictated through grandiose threats. This was different, calm, measured, almost scholarly in its approach. The repeated references to "our future prince" suggested that Rhaegar might be the one authoring these pleas. And then there was the wax seal, pressed deeply and carefully, signifying that whomever had sealed it wanted to ensure the letter arrived intact and unread by curious middlemen. Luwin looked up at Ned, his chain clinking softly as he shifted. "Lord Stark," he said quietly, "this is no forgery. There is sincerity here, I am sure of it." Ned nodded. He felt neither relief nor dread, only the cold knowledge that the next step must be taken carefully. Ned wondered if the Targaryens knew about Lyanna, if Rhaegar was desperate for some reconciliation through the bond they had created. Whatever that bond might be. The letter made an oblique reference to the lady in our midst, carefully avoiding naming her, as though the writer feared the words might reach the wrong eyes. Perhaps that was wise. The realm believed Lyanna had been abducted. Robert's fury stemmed from the violation he believed had been done to his betrothed. If Lyanna herself did not refute these accusations publicly, how was Ned to believe she was safe and willing? The question haunted him. He found himself yearning for her presence, for an explanation from her own lips. But that was a luxury he might never have. So, in that silent room, with only a handful of candles flickering against the stone walls, Eddard Stark made a decision that would alter the course of the rebellion, the fate of the Targaryen dynasty, and the entire future of the Seven Kingdoms. He would answer the call of parley. He would meet with the Targaryens in secret. And if what they said was true, if Rhaegar truly did desire a peaceful resolution, Ned would listen. In listening, he knew he risked betraying Robert, but perhaps that betrayal might save lives. When the Raven carried Ned's missive south, he felt the weight of it, as though he had just struck a bargain with an untrustworthy spirit in the haunted crypts beneath Winterfell. The words he sent were careful, couched in politeness but open to the possibility of negotiation. If Rhaegar did indeed hold some measure of power over his father, or at least influence, perhaps there was a pathway to end this madness without more needless bloodshed. For Robert, vengeance had become personal, but for Ned, it was not about vengeance anymore. It was about the realm, his people, and his sister. He felt a pang of guilt at the thought of meeting Targaryen envoys behind Robert's back. Yet, he reassured himself. He was not wholly certain he would commit to their cause. That would require more proof. Still, he was opening a door that had been, to his knowledge, firmly bolted ever since the war began. Several weeks later, Ned left Winterfell under the pretense of gathering loyal bannermen to renew the push south. His retinue was small, carefully chosen. Ser Roderick Castle, Jory Castle, and a handful of others he trusted implicitly. They were told only that Lord Stark had business along the King's Road and that it was crucial for the North's part in the war. None questioned him openly. House Stark had always been a pillar of integrity, and if Ned said the business was for the good of the North, they believed him. Yet Ned himself felt the tremor in his hand as he mounted his horse. Once he stepped onto this path, there would be little chance to turn back without grave consequences. He arrived at a lonely inn near the edge of the neck, where the chill waters turned the ground into a maze of bogs. The innkeeper bowed deeply to Lord Stark of Winterfell, though Ned asked for discretion. He paid generously to ensure no word of his presence traveled beyond those walls. That night, Ned and his men took 2 adjoining rooms and locked them. In the hour before dawn, a hooded figure knocked softly. Roderick opened the door with sword in hand, but Ned gestured for him to stand down. Under the hood was a man who introduced himself as Ser Jonathan Darry of the Kingsguard, once sworn to protect Prince Rhaegar. Darry removed his hood and knelt, offering Ned the courtesy of addressing him with respect. The tension in the room was thick as the Northman eyed the sworn sword of the royal family. But Ned, steadying his breath, invited Darry to speak. Ser Jonathan explained that Prince Rhaegar had asked him to escort Ned to a safer location for their meeting. He assured Ned that Prince Rhaegar had no intention of harming him. On the contrary, Rhaegar believed Ned to be a man of principle and honor, the very man he hoped would see reason in ending the war. He also wishes to allay any fears about the Lady Lyanna, Darry said, his voice quiet. He knows her safety weighs upon your heart more than anything. Ned felt an ache swell in his chest. Is she? He could scarcely finish the question. The Kingsguard knight gave a small nod. She is safe, my lord, unharmed and free in her movements, though she remains hidden. It is the prince's desire that you see her yourself, when the time is right. That was all Ned needed to hear. Whatever cunning plan might be at play, if there was any truth in Darry's words, Ned had to see for himself. Under cover of darkness, Ned and his trusted men departed with Ser Jonathan. They wound their way through the swamps of the Neck, traveling small byways and hidden trails that only the most skilled scouts knew. Eventually, they reached more open country, but they avoided major roads that might be patrolled by rebel or royal forces alike. Days blended into nights, the group riding in tense silence. Ned wondered what Robert would do if he discovered this clandestine journey. Even if Ned's intentions were to glean the truth, Robert would call it treason. A betrayal of everything they had fought for. The knowledge that he might be declared a traitor before the entire realm sat heavily on Ned's shoulders. Yet he continued onward. In the hush of early morning, they found themselves at an abandoned holdfast near the banks of a wide, slow-moving river. Tattered banners hung over the old battlements, but they were impossible to read. The structure looked as though it had been abandoned for decades. Its gates stood open, rusted hinges creaking in the wind. Within the courtyard, Ned's men formed a perimeter, though it was clear that if a trap waited for them, they were too small a band to fight it off. Ser Jonathan rode through the gate with confidence, glancing back at Ned as if to offer reassurance. Then, from within a small tower, another man stepped forth. He wore no armor, only a plain black cloak and a tunic. Atop his head was hair as silver as the moon, falling across his shoulders. The face was stern yet carried a certain sorrow. There was no mistaking him. Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, heir to the Iron Throne. Ned felt his pulse quicken. This was the man who had set the realm aflame, at least in Robert's telling. The realm believed Rhaegar had kidnapped Lyanna Stark, spurring the North and the Stormlands to rebellion. Yet here he stood, unguarded and calm, eyes fixed not with the madness of his father but with a kind of weary desperation. He gave a slight bow, one princeling to another lord, though in rank, Rhaegar was Ned's superior. Lord Stark, Rhaegar said quietly, his voice trembling with emotion. I thank you for agreeing to meet me in peace. Ned dismounted carefully, heart hammering in his chest. He thought of Robert's face contorted in rage, of Jon Arryn's patient wisdom, of the vow he had made to protect his sister. But he also thought of the 1,000 men who had already died needlessly. Prince Rhaegar, Ned answered, dipping his head in a courtesy that was neither obsequious nor defiant. I come for answers. They retreated to the tower's main hall, a dusty chamber lit by a few torches that Ser Jonathan and another knight, Ser Barristan Selmy, to Ned's surprise, had prepared in advance. There, Rhaegar spoke at length of the conflict, explaining how his father's madness had escalated beyond what Rhaegar could control. He confessed that he had indeed formed a bond with Lyanna Stark, but not by force. She had come to care for him, and he for her, in ways that defied the realm's expectations. He admitted that perhaps it had been folly to keep their union secret, but they had both feared the consequences of a public announcement, especially given the Mad King's volatility and Robert's own fiery nature. Ned listened, stoic, as Rhaegar recounted how he had tried to convince his father to treat with the North and the Stormlands, only for Aerys to insist on the execution of Rickard and Brandon Stark. Rhaegar's voice shook with regret at having failed to prevent that atrocity. He apologized to Ned, looking him in the eye with genuine sorrow. "I should have stood against him then," Rhaegar admitted, "but I was not strong enough in court. My father's men surrounded him, and even those who served me were afraid of his wrath." Ned was not easily swayed by words, no matter how earnest they seemed. Yet he could feel the weight of Rhaegar's sincerity. This was not a cunning ploy to continue the war. If anything, it was a desperate attempt to end it without more bloodshed. They spoke through the night, discussing the possibility that if the rebels would stand down, if the North and the Vale and the Stormlands would withdraw their forces, Rhaegar would demand the king show mercy. More than that, the prince hinted that he himself might be able to secure the crown, deposing his father if necessary. It was treason for Rhaegar to speak of usurping Aerys, and treason for Ned to listen. But the realm was already steeped in treason on all sides. Ned admitted that Robert would never forgive the Targaryens for what happened to Lyanna, not unless Lyanna herself came forward. And even then, Robert's sense of betrayal ran deep. If Robert refused to budge, Rhaegar asked, would Ned still remain by Robert's side? That question felt like a blade pressing to Ned's throat. He thought of everything Robert had done for him. He thought, too, of the future that might be possible if a just and stable king sat the Iron Throne. A king who did not crave vengeance but desired to heal the realm's wounds. Before dawnlight touched the horizon, Rhaegar stood and beckoned Ned to follow him up the tower's winding stair. High above, in a room that smelled of old stone and dust, Lyanna Stark waited. She wore a simple gown of gray, her dark hair braided down her back. Upon seeing Ned, tears welled in her eyes. She rushed forward and embraced him. It was no captive's embrace, no forced performance. She held him fiercely, as though relieved to see a piece of her old life again. "Ned," she whispered, voice choked with emotion. "I wanted to tell you, I wanted to warn you, but there was never a right moment." Ned gently put his hands on her shoulders and looked into her face. She did not appear frightened or abused. She appeared happy, albeit weighed down by the gloom of a war raging in her name. "You're safe?" he asked, his voice scarcely above a whisper. She nodded. "Rhaegar has protected me from father's madness. I know how it must look, but I swear to you I chose this." Her words carried conviction. Over the next hours, Ned spoke privately with his sister. She spoke of secret promises, of ancient prophecies Rhaegar believed in. She told Ned how Rhaegar's sense of duty warred with the knowledge that his father was beyond salvation. She insisted that Rhaegar would be a better king, one who could unite the 7 kingdoms and perhaps avert some greater doom that loomed unseen. Ned, ever pragmatic, questioned her thoroughly. He reminded her of their father's execution. She bowed her head in grief, acknowledging that Rhaegar bore some responsibility for not stopping it. But she also explained how fear had paralyzed him. Fear that even more innocents, including Rhaegar's own wife and children, would be destroyed by Aerys' paranoia if he acted rashly. By the time their conversation ended, Ned felt his world had turned inside out. Lyanna was not a prisoner. She had chosen this path. And Rhaegar, though flawed, was not the monster Robert insisted he was. Ned returned to the main hall as dawn broke. Rhaegar had fallen asleep in a chair, arms crossed, head bowed. Ser Barristan stood nearby, eyes alert despite the night's length. The knight gave Ned a respectful nod but said nothing, allowing the Northman to gather his thoughts. When Rhaegar stirred, he looked at Ned with a weary hope. "You have seen her," he said simply. Ned nodded. "I have." A long silence followed. Ned felt the weight of Robert's cause, the rebellion that had garnered so much support across the realm. He thought of the cost in men and resources, the ravaging of the Riverlands, the sorrow of the North. But then he thought of how one decisive stroke could end it all. If he could persuade his men, if he could call upon the other houses to consider a truce, if he could help Rhaegar remove Aerys from the throne. The risk was monumental. If Robert discovered Ned's intentions, he would brand him a traitor, and the North would be torn asunder. But if Ned did nothing, If he continued on the path of war, thousands more would die, and perhaps the realm would be shattered beyond repair. He drew a deep breath, recalling how the old gods watched him from the heart tree at Winterfell. His father had raised him to be honorable, to do what was right even when it was difficult. Betraying Robert felt like a betrayal of that honor, but perhaps it was Robert's cause that had become tainted, transformed into a vendetta that served only more bloodshed. "I will help you," Ned said at last, his voice low. "I will return to my bannermen. I will attempt to turn them to your cause. But you must swear that, when your father is dethroned, there will be justice, not vengeance. The realm must heal." Rhaegar's eyes glistened as though he had long awaited this moment. "On my life I swear it," he said. "There will be no more wanton executions. The Riverlands shall be restored, the North shall be honored, and all who lay down there. Swords in peace shall be pardoned. My father's madness must end, and a new age must begin." Ned simply nodded, uncertain of the future but steeling himself for the storm to come. The journey back to Winterfell was fraught with tension. Ned's men asked few questions, but they sensed something had shifted in their lord. He was quieter than usual, deep in introspection. When they finally reached the familiar gates, Ned summoned his most loyal vassals, Roose Bolton, Wyman Manderly, and others he dared trust with this dangerous knowledge. He revealed to them the truth about Lyanna's situation, or at least as much of it as he could without losing them entirely. He spoke of Rhaegar's willingness to end the war peacefully, to remove Aerys from power, and to spare all who laid down their arms. The lords were stunned, and not all were receptive. Bolton, ever the pragmatist, asked pointedly what place the North would have in such a new order. Manderly worried about the cost if Robert marched north to punish them for any sign of defection. But Ned addressed them calmly, reminding them that the rebellion had been sparked by Aerys' cruelty, not necessarily by Rhaegar. If the Mad King was removed and Rhaegar took the throne, the reason for war might cease. For House Stark, this meant preserving more lives and ensuring stability. Some of the lords balked. They had already seen enough of Targaryen rule to distrust any silver-haired monarch. They demanded proof that Rhaegar's promises were sincere. Ned told them he had seen Lyanna with his own eyes, that she was unharmed and willingly in Rhaegar's company. This was the part that caused outcry. To many, it meant that Lyanna had betrayed her betrothal to Robert. But to Ned, it meant that Robert's entire reason for vengeance might be based on a falsehood. There was no abduction. The truth might crumble the foundation of the rebellion. Yet Ned knew the truth alone wouldn't save them from Robert's fury. If they turned on him now, they would have to do so with the strength of a united North, capable of defending itself against any retribution. That was the gamble. Either stand with Robert to the end, or break from him and join Rhaegar's secret plot to topple Aerys and end the war. Days turned into weeks as Ned negotiated with his bannermen, carefully feeling out who could be trusted, who might be swayed, and who would cling to the rebellion no matter what. Ravens flew to certain houses, coded messages implying that if they wished to avoid further bloodshed, they should remain alert for a new development in the royal conflict. Some responded with curiosity, others with anger, and a few with cautious support. Ned knew time was short. Robert was gathering his forces for a major push into the Crownlands, determined to strike at the heart of Targaryen power. Jon Arryn and the Lords of the Vale supported him wholeheartedly. The River Lords, led by Hoster Tully, remained allied with them, although they, too, were weary of war. Ned had to decide if he would warn Rhaegar of Robert's movements. Already, ravens from the prince hinted at a plan. Rhaegar would confront his father and demand that he step down, or else Rhaegar would publicly declare himself for the rebels. But to do so without support from at least one major faction of the rebellion would be tantamount to suicide. Rhaegar needed Ned to break away from Robert and stand with him, to show the realm that if even the son of the murdered Lord Stark could forgive the Targaryen line, there must be reason. The intricacy of it made Ned's head spin, but he could see the shape of the plan. If it succeeded, the war would end swiftly. If it failed, Ned would be labeled the worst of traitors, and the North would suffer as never before. He was standing on the walls of Winterfell one evening when a messenger arrived, breathless and mud-splattered, bearing word that Robert had won a victory against a loyalist army near the Ruby Ford. His victory had been decisive, and the loyalists had fled back to King's Landing. The rumors said that Prince Rhaegar was nowhere to be found in that battle, that he was still away negotiating alliances. Ned felt relief mixed with dread. Relief that Rhaegar was still at large, dread that Robert's momentum would only grow. Then, another piece of news. Tywin Lannister was marching. The cunning lord of Casterly Rock had kept his banners out of the conflict until now, but he was rumored to be making his move. No one knew for certain which side Tywin would join, but Ned had heard from Rhaegar that the Lannisters were poised to betray the Mad King at the slightest advantage. If Robert's host reached the gates of King's Landing and Tywin's forces converged from the west, the city would be under siege. Aerys, in his madness, might unleash dragonfire upon them all. The realm could burn. Ned felt a cold sweat upon his brow at the thought of wildfire ravaging the capital. In the privacy of his solar, Ned drafted a letter to Rhaegar, warning him of Robert's impending advance. He advised the prince to move swiftly in deposing his father, lest the city fall to Robert or Tywin. At the bottom, he scrawled a simple line: "The North stands with you if you prove your words with deeds." He sealed the letter and gave it to a courier he trusted more than his own blood. Then, heart heavy, Ned prepared for the aftermath. To convince the majority of the North, Ned had to lay out the possibility of a negotiated peace that would see Rhaegar crowned and the Mad King removed. He appealed to the memory of Torrhen Stark, the king who knelt, who had spared the North from Aegon's conquest centuries ago. Ned insisted that sometimes, the surest way to protect one's people was to bend the knee when the alternative was devastation. The lords muttered among themselves. Some accused Ned of weakness. Others saw grim wisdom in the parallels. After all, if Rhaegar was truly different from his father, perhaps a new Targaryen reign would not be a curse upon the North. They remembered the brutality they had suffered in the rebellion already, the men lost in foreign fields. If there was a chance to avoid further ruin, they would consider it. But to declare openly for Rhaegar was still too risky, so Ned took a subtler path. He called upon certain lords to march south under a guise of reinforcing Robert, but with instructions not to engage in the final battle unless Ned gave the order. It was a precarious masquerade, one that relied on timing and secrecy. If Robert discovered the duplicity before Rhaegar could act, all would be lost. If Rhaegar acted too soon, Ned's forces might not be in place to support him. Every raven that arrived, every rumor from the south, set Ned's nerves on edge. Days became a blur of anxious preparation. Word finally came that Robert had crossed into the Crownlands, driving the last loyalist defenders before him. Tywin Lannister's forces were reported near the Gold Road, poised to strike King's Landing from the west. In King's Landing itself, Aerys' madness raged. He had locked himself in the Red Keep, ordering his pyromancers to stash wildfire throughout the city. Prince Rhaegar, so the rumors said, had gone into the city under the cover of night, accompanied by a small loyal guard. Then, from behind the Red Keep's walls, no one knew exactly what transpired. Days passed without word. Robert's army drew closer to the city's gates. The tension hung like thunderclouds ready to unleash a storm. Ned mustered his own troops and marched south, traveling more quickly than usual, for time was a razor's edge. They skirted the main thoroughfares, hoping to avoid direct contact with Robert's outriders. But eventually, near a crossroads, they encountered a detachment of Robert's men. The banners of House Baratheon, black stag on a field of gold, fluttered in the breeze. Leading them was a knight Ned recognized, Ser Gaillard Morrigan, a staunch supporter of the rebellion. Ser Gaillard greeted Ned warmly, assuming he had come to join forces. With practiced composure, Ned played along, claiming he wanted to ensure that they closed off any route by which the Targaryens might flee north. Ser Gaillard seemed relieved. "Robert will be glad to have your sword again, my lord. He's been wondering about your delay." Ned feigned regret, explaining that winter provisions had delayed his muster. Ser Gaillard accepted this, though Ned could sense a hint of suspicion in the knight's eyes. Word of Ned's fatherly nature and careful stewardship of the North was well known. But so too was the rumor that the Starks were reluctant to endure a lengthy war so far from home. Still, the two armies joined for a time, traveling along the roads toward King's Landing. Ned's men, sworn to secrecy, held their tongues. Meanwhile, Ned anxiously awaited any sign that Rhaegar had succeeded in deposing his father. If the city opened its gates in Rhaegar's name, it would change everything. If not, they might be marching into a slaughter. Then, like lightning across a stormy sky, news arrived. Aerys was dead. Rhaegar had confronted his father in the throne room, backed by Kingsguard loyal to the prince. In a final act of madness, Aerys had tried to ignite the wildfire caches throughout the city, but Rhaegar's allies had subdued the pyromancers. Somehow, the Mad King had been slain, accounts varied. Some said Rhaegar struck the fatal blow. Others claimed Jaime Lannister, newly sworn to the Kingsguard, put a sword through the king to stop him from burning the city. The details were murky, but one fact stood out. The Mad King was no more, and Rhaegar Targaryen intended to claim the Iron Throne. An uproar tore through Robert's forces when the news arrived. Many cheered. After all, the rebellion's primary goal, the dethroning of the Mad King, had been achieved. But Robert himself was not satisfied. The Targaryen line still lived, and Rhaegar, the man he deemed responsible for Lyanna's abduction, would now wear the crown. Robert demanded that the army continue its march, to unseat Rhaegar as well. Despite Aerys' death, Robert's rage remained undiminished. For him, Rhaegar was the heart of the wrong. The troops were divided. Some questioned whether they should continue now that the threat of Aerys was gone. But Robert's personal charisma and the momentum of the war still drove them forward. King's Landing would be theirs, Robert declared, and the Targaryens would be wiped out in the name of justice for Lyanna Stark and the countless lives lost. That was the moment Ned had dreaded. He stood in Robert's tent, having arrived with his men, feeling the furnace of Robert's hatred. "We have won," Ned tried to reason. "Aerys is dead. The war should end." But Robert roared, "It's not over until the last Targaryen breathes his last. They will never be safe for the realm, Ned. You know what they did to your father." Ned thought of Rhaegar's regret of Lyanna's choice. He could not reveal the truth, that Lyanna had willingly joined Rhaegar. That would drive Robert mad with sorrow and fury. Instead, he spoke calmly. "Rhaegar is not his father. The city need not burn. Let us send envoys and see if they will surrender peacefully. If they do, the killing can stop." Robert's face twisted in scorn. "I will send no envoys. I will tear down the Red Keep myself if I must. You can stand with me or stand aside, Stark. But by the gods, you will not counsel me to let Rhaegar live." That night, Ned knew the die was cast. He summoned his most loyal men and told them they would break from Robert's forces at dawn. "We ride for the city, to aid the prince in preserving peace. Spread the word carefully among our ranks. Those who follow me, follow quietly." The men nodded, though some looked uneasy. They had known Robert as an ally, perhaps even a friend, but they would obey their lord's command. In the first gray light of morning, while Robert's camp was still stirring, Ned Stark and a core contingent of Northmen slipped away. A few loyal Baratheon scouts noticed, but not in time to stop them. By the time Robert realized Ned had departed, the Northmen were far along a lesser-known route through the hills. Robert cursed Ned's name, calling him a traitor, vowing to mount his head on a spike if they ever crossed paths again. Ned's heart pounded as they rode toward King's Landing. He had cast aside his friendship with Robert, a bond forged in childhood. But he reminded himself that he was doing it not for ambition or greed, but for the sake of saving the realm from a bitter war that had turned into a personal vendetta. If Rhaegar proved false, Ned knew he might face a traitor's death. But if Rhaegar was true, then perhaps Ned could save countless lives. They reached the city to find the gates manned by soldiers loyal to the prince. Tension ran along the walls. Many small folk cowered inside their homes, fearing the worst. The memory of the sack of King's Landing during the end of the reign of the last Targaryen king's hand, Tywin Lannister's brutal ransacking in a previous conflict, was fresh in the minds of older residents. Ned and his men were halted at spearpoint, but when Ned announced himself and his intention to speak with Prince Rhaegar, word was sent to the Red Keep. Presently, the gates swung open to allow him inside. The city had the hush of an impending storm. Whispers and rumors danced in every alley. Inside the Red Keep, Ned was quickly ushered to the throne room. A scorched patch on the marble floor bore silent testament to the wildfire that Aerys had tried to unleash, but it had been contained. Guards lined the walls. At the foot of the Iron Throne, Rhaegar stood, dressed in plain black. His face was pale and drawn, the weight of kingship having fallen on him in the midst of a war. He descended the steps to greet Ned, pressing a hand over his heart in gratitude. "Lord Stark," he said, voice echoing in the grand hall. "You have come." Ned gave a slight bow. "I gave you my word. The North will stand with you if you are true to your vows." Rhaegar nodded. He looked over Ned's shoulder at the assembled Northmen. Many wore expressions of suspicion, but none openly challenged the new king. Rhaegar began to speak. "I have declared myself King Rhaegar of House Targaryen, first of my name. My father was unfit to rule. The throne belongs to me by birth, but it is not enough to hold it by birth alone. I must earn the faith of my people." He cast his gaze across the room. "I have sent word to every corner of the realm, proclaiming an end to hostilities for all who lay down their arms. No man who fought for the rebellion shall be punished if he swears fealty to the new crown. I offer clemency and peace. The only question is, will they listen? Will Robert Baratheon accept a kingdom without Aerys, or will he continue his war?" Ned knew the answer. He looked at Rhaegar gravely. "Robert will come. He will not rest until he sees you dead. The Lannisters may yet join him if they see an advantage. You must prepare the city's defenses. But remember, your best weapon is not wildfire or swords. It is showing the realm that you are different from your father, that you will rule justly." Rhaegar nodded in agreement, though he looked tense. "I have no desire to slaughter Robert's men in the streets, but if he forces the issue, I must defend my people." Ned understood the conundrum. By returning to King's Landing, Ned had already branded himself a traitor in Robert's eyes. There would be no going back. Within days, Robert's army appeared on the horizon. Thousands of men, battered from months of war, marched with grim determination. At their head, Robert himself rode, a massive warhammer slung across his saddle. Beside him were lords of the Stormlands, the Vale, and the Riverlands. Banners fluttered in the wind. The sight was awe-inspiring, but inside the city, Rhaegar's supporters numbered in the thousands as well, bolstered by the Crownlands and certain royalist houses who rejoiced at Aerys' death and pinned their hopes on Rhaegar's rumored mercy. The walls of King's Landing bristled with archers and scorpions. For a moment, it seemed an all-out siege was inevitable. The day Robert arrived, he sent an envoy under a white flag to demand Rhaegar's surrender. The herald's voice quaked as he read aloud Robert's declaration. "Abandon your false crown, deliver Lyanna Stark unharmed, and face the king in the North's justice, or we shall storm your walls and end the Targaryen line forever." Ned, standing beside Rhaegar, felt his stomach clench. Robert had called himself king in the North, perhaps believing Ned's betrayal signaled the North was lost. Rhaegar responded with his own envoy, announcing that Lyanna was unharmed, that she would appear soon to speak for herself, and that the war could end if Robert would lay down arms and accept a royal pardon for all rebels. The herald returned to Robert's camp, but no reply came. Instead, the rebel army began to make camp around the city, setting the stage for siege. Ned knew it would come to a final confrontation. If Robert refused even to see reason, then the only way out was battle. Or so it seemed. Rhaegar, determined not to inflict the horrors of a siege on the city's population, proposed a parley, offering single combat between champions if it could prevent bloodshed. Word of this proposition swept through both camps. Many clamored for it. If Robert and Rhaegar settled the matter in a duel, the realm might be spared a costly battle. Robert, proud and confident in his strength, accepted without hesitation. The date was set, and thousands gathered on the open field outside King's Landing to witness the fate of the realm rest upon the skill of two men. On the morning of the duel, Ned rode out with Rhaegar, who wore plain armor without the gaudy ornaments of his father's court. Robert stood at the opposite end of the field, garbed in gleaming steel, his hammer resting on his shoulder. The crowds of soldiers parted, forming a circle for the combat. A hush fell over the assembly. For a moment, Ned almost believed Robert and Rhaegar might see each other as they once were. Two men who loved a good fight, who had laughter in their hearts. But the war had turned them into bitter enemies. Robert's eyes blazed with hatred as he beheld Rhaegar. Rhaegar's expression was somber, tinged with a quiet resolve. They met in the center, bows exchanged curtly, and then the fight began. Robert swung his hammer with the fury of a tempest, each blow heavy enough to shatter shields and bones. Rhaegar, more agile, evaded or parried, looking for openings. The ground trembled beneath the force of their collisions. Moments stretched into what felt like an eternity. Nearby soldiers held their breath. The clang of steel resonated across the field. Rhaegar managed to wound Robert's arm, drawing first blood. The onlookers gasped. Robert, grimacing, pressed the attack with renewed ferocity. One blow caught Rhaegar's shoulder, denting his armor and staggering him. A second hammer strike nearly knocked him off his feet. But Rhaegar recovered, slashing at Robert's side. Sweat glistened on both men. Their expressions were masks of determination. Ned watched, heart pounding. He found himself silently urging Rhaegar to land a conclusive strike. But Robert fought as though possessed by the old gods, unstoppable, fueled by heartbreak and rage. Then, in a swift, brutal maneuver, Robert caught Rhaegar off balance, his hammer crashing into Rhaegar's breastplate with a sickening crunch. Rhaegar fell to one knee, gasping for breath, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. The crowd roared, expecting Robert to finish him. Robert lifted the hammer high, poised to deliver a killing blow. At that moment, a figure rode forth onto the field. Lyanna Stark, astride a horse, calling out "F.O." Robert to stop. Her cry was piercing, laden with desperation. Robert froze, shock washing over his face. Lyanna dismounted and ran toward Rhaegar, kneeling beside him, trying to shield him from the next blow. A ripple of confusion and astonishment swept through both armies. Some recognized Lyanna from her betrothal to Robert. Others had only heard stories. Robert stood there, hammer raised, unable to comprehend why Lyanna was protecting Rhaegar. In a trembling voice, Lyanna told Robert the truth, that she had chosen Rhaegar, that she was not abducted. She pleaded with him to see that killing Rhaegar now would only perpetuate the cycle of vengeance. She confessed she had never wanted a marriage formed solely by the will of their families. She had found something else in Rhaegar, and while it might have begun in secrecy, it was real. The field was deathly silent. Robert's chest heaved, his eyes flickering with betrayal, heartbreak, fury. For a moment, it seemed he might bring the hammer down on them both. Ned watched, every muscle tense, hand on the hilt of his sword, prepared to intervene if Robert attempted to kill his sister. Robert's knuckles turned white on the haft of his hammer. His face twisted as though waging war with itself. Then, in a guttural scream, he hurled the hammer to the ground. He turned away, tears of anger burning in his eyes. The rebellion's men stood, stunned. Many cried out in confusion. Some demanded that Robert finish it. Others recognized that if Lyanna Stark had truly chosen Rhaegar, the rebellion's cause was undermined. In that chaos, Ned ran forward, helping Rhaegar to his feet, while Lyanna stood between him and Robert. For a few agonizing moments, no one knew what would happen next. Robert stalked off, leaving the circle, ignoring the protests of his bannermen. He seemed lost, shattered. The war, the vengeance, everything had come down to a personal heartbreak. Some lords rushed after him, demanding he not abandon the fight. But Robert brushed them aside. "It's done," he muttered, voice hollow. "The Mad King is dead. The realm is safe. What have I been fighting for?" Then, to Ned's shock, Robert mounted his horse and rode away, his personal guard following in confusion. Chaos threatened to erupt among the rebels. Some insisted they had come to dethrone all Targaryens and would not leave until it was done. Others saw no reason to continue once Robert himself had withdrawn. Slowly, it became clear that the backbone of the rebellion was broken. Without Robert's leadership, the Stormlords were divided. Jon Arryn, grieved by the strife and no doubt uncertain about the revelations, withdrew his Vale Knights, unwilling to shed more blood that day. Hoster Tully, seeing his prospective son-in-law in anguish, stepped back as well, urging a cessation of hostilities. In the days that followed, Rhaegar called a grand council in King's Landing, inviting all lords who had taken part in the war to attend. Some came grudgingly, others hopefully. Ned remained by Rhaegar's side, though the future was still precarious. The Targaryen line was not beloved by many, and mistrust lingered. But the harsh truth was that the realm was weary. War had left them all scarred. Rhaegar offered generous terms: full pardons for rebel lords, restitution to the families who had suffered under Aerys, and representation in a restructured small council that would give voice to more of the realm's great houses. Tired of fighting, many accepted. Some never would. Tywin Lannister, seeing a chance to maintain his power, declared that he had marched to defend the city all along. An obvious lie, but Rhaegar, recognizing the need for unity, accepted Tywin's feigned loyalty. As for Robert, he returned to Storm's End in bitter silence. Rumors said he fell into despair and drink. Others claimed he planned one day to raise banners anew. But for the moment, the realm's appetite for war had run dry. Jon Arryn, too, retired to the Vale, quietly disappointed that his foster sons had ended up on opposite sides. The official story circulated that Robert had relinquished his claim once Aerys was overthrown. In truth, the heartbreak of Lyanna's choice had crushed his spirit. Ned remained in King's Landing long enough to see Rhaegar crowned in a ceremony far more subdued than any that had come before. A hush fell in the throne room as Rhaegar took his seat on the Iron Throne, the ancient sword metal cutting an imposing silhouette. Lyanna stood at his side, not yet queen, for Rhaegar's marriage to Elia Martell still existed. Yet, in an unprecedented move to maintain peace, Rhaegar and Elia reached a private arrangement that allowed Lyanna to remain part of his life. An arrangement that would scandalize many, but might avoid plunging Dorne into revolt. The politics were delicate, and the realm would whisper of it for generations. But for now, the main horror, the Mad King's tyranny and the endless war, was ended. When Ned finally prepared to return to Winterfell, Rhaegar walked with him to the gates of the Red Keep. The newly anointed king placed a hand on Ned's shoulder. "I owe you my life," he said, "and the realm owes you its peace. For your loyalty and your wisdom, you will always have my gratitude." Ned nodded, his expression modest. "I did what I felt was right," he said simply. "Now the North must see that I have not betrayed them, but guided them to a safer future." Rhaegar inclined his head. "They will see it in time. Should you ever have need of me, send word. I want to ensure the North prospers under this new reign." So Ned departed, unsure of what reception he would find in his own lands. He traveled back along the King's Road, where the scars of war were still evident: burned farms, shattered keeps. He hoped that, with peace, the realm could begin to heal. And though he had betrayed a friend, a part of him believed that Robert, if he ever escaped the shadow of his heartbreak, might one day see that Ned had spared Westeros a deeper ruin. When he finally returned to Winterfell, the snows were falling, a reminder that winter was always just around the corner in the north. He knew there would be questions, accusations, resentments from some of his own bannermen. He would answer them as calmly as he could, pointing to the final outcome: the Mad King's death, the realm intact, no vengeful purge of the north. He would speak of the countless lives saved by ending the war before it devoured them all. Perhaps some would never understand, or never forgive him for betraying Robert. But Ned remembered standing in the Godswood, that moment of weighing the realm's fate in his hands. Honor had compelled him to do this. Honor, not just of friendship, but a higher honor to protect the innocent from the ravages of a war that no longer made sense. In the months that followed, the Seven Kingdoms began a slow process of recovery. Rhaegar's reign, as promised, was gentler than his father's, though it faced challenges. The memory of Aerys' cruelties did not vanish overnight. Rivals watched closely, ready to exploit any weakness. But with the support of key houses, Martell, Tully, and even Lannister, Rhaegar maintained his hold on the throne. He sent relief to the war-torn Riverlands, winning some measure of goodwill. He invited the Lords Paramount to King's Landing for a grand feast, presenting them with gifts and reaffirming their rights. Ned attended, albeit quietly, observing how the city's mood had shifted. There was still tension, of course, but no longer that oppressive sense of dread that had reigned under Aerys. Lyanna seldom appeared in public, still weary from the scandal of her relationship. But when she did, she carried herself with a dignity befitting a lady of House Stark. She acknowledged the whispers with a level gaze. There were rumors she was carrying Rhaegar's child, though no official announcement was made. Ned could only hope that her happiness would not be overshadowed by the inevitable intrigues of court. He worried for her, but each time he visited the capital, she assured him that Rhaegar's love and Elia Martell's surprising acceptance had sheltered her from harm. As time passed, the realm reached a tenuous peace. There were pockets of discontent, particularly in the Stormlands, where Robert's supporters gathered in hushed corners, muttering that the Targaryens should never have been allowed to survive. But without Robert's fiery leadership at the fore, these murmurs remained local grumblings rather than a renewed rebellion. Robert himself slipped further into isolation, rarely leaving Storm's End. Rumor had it he drank his nights away, haunted by dreams of Lyanna and the life he thought was stolen from him. Some say Stannis, his dour and duty-bound brother, tried to rally him to challenge Rhaegar again, but it never took hold. The realm was simply too weary for another war. Ned devoted himself to the north, ensuring its resources were replenished, helping villages rebuild from the cost of sending men south. He upheld his end of the agreement with Rhaegar, paying taxes to the Iron Throne, but receiving fair treatment in return. Letters arrived from King's Landing detailing new reforms, some focusing on trade, others on the oversight of the crown's finances. Ned read them carefully, seeing glimpses of Rhaegar's thoughtful approach. He did not doubt that the king's duties weighed heavily upon the man, particularly after the horrors that had come before. Occasionally, visitors would arrive at Winterfell from far-flung corners of the realm, merchants, travelers, even the occasional noble, curious about the lord who had once been a rebel but turned to help a Targaryen ascend the throne. They found Ned Stark not the cunning schemer they imagined, but a quiet, stern figure, unwavering in his sense of responsibility. More than once, Ned fielded questions about whether he had regrets. Did he wish he had stood beside Robert to the bitter end? Each time, he answered with the same tempered calm. He had done what he believed necessary to save the realm from a greater evil. That was all there was to say. And so the years began to roll forward under Rhaegar's reign. The scars of war lingered, but a new generation would grow up without the memory of the Mad King's terror or the immediate slaughter of the rebellion. Rhaegar worked to foster unity, forging alliances through marriages and treaties. He named a new Kingsguard, men of proven honor, though the memory of Jaime Lannister's role in slaying Aerys caused many to nickname him the Kingslayer. Yet, rather than condemn Jaime, Rhaegar accepted him, citing the act as necessary to save King's Landing from destruction. To some, this was a sign of Rhaegar's pragmatism. To others, it was proof of how deeply the realm was prepared to bury the sins of the past if it meant moving forward. Ned found himself standing once again in the God's Wood of Winterfell, watching the red leaves dance in a gentle breeze. The years had not dulled his memory of that moment, when he had first contemplated reaching out to the Targaryens. He sometimes wondered if his father or brother would have approved of his choice. They had been victims of the Mad King, after all. But the Mad King was gone, and the realm had avoided an even greater bloodbath. Perhaps, in time, the ghosts of Rickard and Brandon would see that Ned had sought a peace they were never afforded. He pressed his hand against the trunk of the weirwood. The old face, carved in the bark, seemed to watch him silently. He thought of Robert, the friend he had lost. Perhaps no measure of time would heal the rift between them. but he held onto the faint hope that one day Robert might find a measure of peace within himself. That day might never come, but it was a hopeful notion to carry in a world that had known too much darkness. Sighing, Ned turned and walked away from the Heart Tree, leaving the Godswood behind. He had tasks to attend to, letters to read, audiences with bannermen, judgments to render as the Lord of Winterfell. Outside, the North bustled with life, unaffected by the day-to-day intrigues of the capital. The people cared more about the coming harvest than the politics of faraway King's Landing. Perhaps that was how it should be, Ned reflected. The less the common folk had to worry about war and kings, the better. And so, in a realm where Ned Stark had betrayed his friend Robert Baratheon to support the Targaryen cause, the Seven Kingdoms found an uneasy but lasting peace under King Rhaegar. The legacy of Aerys' terror remained a grim reminder, a cautionary tale about the perils of unchecked power. Yet a glimmer of hope endured, resting on the shoulders of a king who sought to rule with wisdom rather than fear, and a northern lord who had dared to break from a friend for the good of the realm. If it was betrayal, it was a betrayal meant to save lives and futures. Some called Ned Stark a traitor behind his back. Others, in hushed voices, called him the realm's quiet savior. Ned would accept neither title. He was only a man who had chosen a hard path when all else seemed lost. In the long nights to come, when winter finally arrived in earnest and the snows piled high, old men would sit in taverns and tell the tale of how Eddard Stark turned from Robert Baratheon and knelt before Rhaegar Targaryen. They would argue whether his decision was born of cunning, mercy, or weakness. They would speak of how the war ended in a singular moment of heartbreak on the field outside King's Landing. Some would claim it was Lyanna Stark's tears that stayed Robert's hammer. Others would say Robert lost his will to fight when he learned the truth. The only certainty was that the realm did not drown in blood that day, and the Targaryen line, against all odds, endured. Ned would never take pride in the moniker of traitor or savior. He only carried on, as Starks always did, fulfilling his duties. The war had ended, and though the personal cost was high, the realm had emerged with fewer scars than it might have otherwise. That was the best he could have hoped for, standing before the Heart Tree in Winterfell's Godswood, uttering a silent prayer to the old gods for guidance. Perhaps they had heard. Perhaps they had guided his hand so that the North, and all the Seven Kingdoms, might have a future free from the shadow of a mad king's cruelty. Even after all these events, after the final battles, the coronation, and the uneasy peace, one question still haunted Ned in quiet moments. Could he have done things differently? Could the realm have been saved without the pain of forsaking his oldest friend? He would never know for sure. The choices he made were the only ones he saw before him. In time, history would judge whether he had been right or wrong. But in the eyes of the old gods, in his own solemn reflection, Eddard Stark believed that he had chosen the path that spared the most lives, that steered the realm away from madness and ruin. For the man he was, that was the only course he could live with. Thus, under the watchful eyes of the Red Keep's new king, and under the guardianship of the once maligned House Stark, the Seven Kingdoms tried to knit themselves back together. The future remained uncertain. There were always new plots and secrets brewing in the shadows, and the seeds of older conflicts did not disappear overnight. But for a moment, at least, the realm knew something akin to peace. And at the center of it all was Ned Stark, the quiet warden of the North, who had walked into the lion's den of treachery and come out bearing not a sword, but a chance at a gentler tomorrow for the realm he loved.